Right. Hello, I am Esprii Chapman, and my senior thesis this year has been spent looking at bias and the perpetuation thereof in judicial algorithmic tools. This presentation will cover my inspiration, traditional and original research, the three universal points of transparency, accountability, and equity, my struggles this year, and finally, my conclusions. My initial inspiration for my research this year came from a number of different factors, from personal interests to real-world events. The first is my personal interest in machine learning and AI, as well as learning the programming language Python. The latter of these two was my first book from the summer Python crash course, which laid out the fundamentals of the language Python for conducting my original research later. The second book, Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil, actually inspired the topic. It speaks to the significant ways that algorithms and data cause everyday injustices, and within that, it focused on the Compass and Impact algorithms. Compass is used within the judicial system, and Impact is used within the public schooling system, specifically for teacher evaluations. What set me on my path with Compass and the injustices in the judicial system was, at the time, the recent significant surge in the Black Lives Matter movement. And as a preface before going into the meat of this presentation, it would be helpful to define some key terms. First, recidivism, or the tendency to relapse into criminal behavior and reoffend after a first offense. Proxy, a strong association between two or more variables, such that one can be taken as a representation of the other. Bias, a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment. Defendant, someone defending themselves in a legal setting against a accuser. And proprietary software, which is software that has restrictions on using, copying, modifying, or reverse engineering it, legally enforced by that software's proprietor or rights holder. Moving on to covering my thesis this year, it states that the implementation of algorithms in the judicial system to determine risk factors and recidivism rates for defendants perpetuates a pre-existing criminal sentencing bias within the US judicial system because of how they were written and bias in the data they are trained on. Large algorithms such as Compass, PSA, and other large pretrial risk assessment algorithms that are being used within the judicial system have demonstrated a clear racial disparity in their risk analyses, and they must be immediately removed from the court's system. The judicial system has long relied on human minds to think out decisions. This changed with the early piloting of algorithms within this system. When implementation started in the early 2000s, they were a tool for judges to use alongside their decision-making process, tools to assist to create a supposedly fair and equitable risk analysis on a defendant. But before we consider that, let's take a step back and answer the question, what is an algorithm? Common algorithms are simple sets of instructions, normally associated with and run by computers. The type of algorithm focused on in this presentation is the machine learning predictive algorithm. These algorithms sift through large amounts of data and find correlations, or proxies, finer than the human eye can see, and then make predictions based on those findings. The most commonly thought of predictive algorithm today, in my mind, is that of targeted or informed advertising. These are advertisements that are tailored to you based on your other internet browsing data. So let's form an example of this targeted advertising and its proxies. Let's say an Amazon user decides to purchase baby diapers. A predictive algorithm run by Amazon then takes that purchase data in, and this algorithm already knows that there is a heavy proxy drawn between a need for baby diapers and a need for baby clothes. This algorithm then tailors this Amazon user's ads to have more baby products in them to try and garner more clicks and purchases. These proxies are drawn by trends or correlation that the predictive algorithm knows. These proxies are correlation rather than causation. As you can see on the slide, I have an example of correlation between the number of people who have died due to drowning in a pool and the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in between 1999 and 2009. You can clearly see that both variables' data clearly correlates, but have absolutely no ground to stand on to make an actual claim for a causal relationship between the two. These proxies used for advertising algorithms are relatively harmless, as the effects of using these are simply to try and garner more sales. However, when brought into the legal setting, correlations and proxies drawn between them can be incredibly misleading and profiling for a defendant. They are based on statistical correlations rather than fact. The first algorithm discussed in this presentation is the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions, or COMPAS for short. It is one of the many algorithms used within New York, Wisconsin, California, Florida, and some other jurisdictions. And COMPAS is the algorithm that will likely come up the most in this presentation, as it is the most mainstream, negatively controversial algorithm being used within the judicial system. It is used to determine the risk of nonviolent and violent recidivism, as well as the usual pretrial risk of flight of a defendant. Public Safety Assessment, or PSA, is one of the most popular algorithms, as it is used across 20 different states in the US. However, not that much mainstream attention has been given to it, as it's never had any large scandals that COMPAS has. PSA is different from COMPAS and is used strictly for pretrial flight risk assessment. These are the two main algorithms covered in this presentation. However, there are an additional 28 risk assessment algorithms made by both private companies and state governments that are used in more specific jurisdictions across the US. This year, for traditional research, I read 5 books: Python Crash Course by Eric Matt, Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill, Moral Machines by Wendell Wallish, Machine Question by David J. Gunkel, and Predictive Machines by A.J. Agrawal, Avi Goldfarb, and Joshua Gons. Of all of these, 2 books, Weapons of Math Destruction and Python Crash Course, were the most useful. Weapons of Math Destruction discussed several examples of different data and algorithmic injustices, and Python Crash Course, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, gave me a good foundation to complete my original research. I've also read several articles, and while not all of them were completely useful to me, the key topics to take away from them consisted of injustices, specifically for the COMPAS algorithm, making use of the ProPublica report on racism within this algorithm, questioning fairness within algorithmic justice entirely, counter-bias algorithms, or algorithms that can account for bias within a judicial algorithm's results, and the 3 universal points of transparency, accountability, and equity, though more on that later. The ProPublica report, titled Machine Bias, was a revealing analysis from 2016 on the racial ethics of COMPAS. Its main points were that, 1, the algorithm was particularly likely to falsely flag Black defendants as future criminals, wrongly labeling them in this way at almost twice the rate of white defendants. 2, white defendants were mislabeled as low risk more often than Black defendants. And 3, Black defendants were 77% more likely to be classified as higher risk of committing a future violent crime, and 45% more likely to be predicted to commit a future crime of any kind. A similar report was done by the University of Minnesota Law School on PSA that found that it was also perpetuating a racial disparity. It was 10% less likely to recommend a non-financial release pre-trial for Black defendants. The individual values for these, as you can see on the slide, were 25% for Black defendants and 35% for white defendants. Back to those 3 universal points, though. I use this wording because of the number of articles I had read that pointed towards what was actually going wrong with these algorithms. Number one is transparency. One of the leading reasons that these algorithms are so dangerous is that we, as the public, cannot see what's happening inside of them, only what's input and output. In 2016, a man named Eric Loomis, who had been arrested for driving a car used in a shooting, challenged the use of Compass on the fact that neither he nor his legal team could analyze it due to its proprietary nature to make sure that it was not taking race or gender into account in its analysis. It was raised to the Wisconsin Supreme Court but denied in 2017, and Loomis was sentenced to jail for 6 years. In theory, publishing this proprietary algorithm's program code, making everything about it available to the public, would resolve the issue raised in this trial. However, my interview said differently. This interview was with Dr. David Luebke, the VP of Graphics Research at NVIDIA, and while his focus is different than mine, working with highly intelligent machine learning algorithms to develop graphical systems, they share many fundamental characteristics with the algorithms used in the judicial system. The key takeaways from this interview were understanding more fundamentals of algorithmic design, the ability to run algorithms in conjunction with each other so that an anti-bias discriminator algorithm could check the input data against the output data to see if the original algorithm is actually learning correctly. And a more key point, which wraps back around, that even full transparency of an algorithm doesn't make it 100% able to be analyzed due to the many layers of training that it has to go through, adjusting in incredibly small steps, which with each self-feedback loop is the data really training itself properly. So transparency is required at the base level, but it might not solve the current issues that the public has with its proprietary nature. It will also need a significant amount of extra explanation and a way to visualize and/or explain the direction training might take. The second of the three universal points is that of accountability. This one is pretty straightforward and without much additional system. These algorithms, for whatever wrongdoings that they may exhibit, need a system of accountability to confirm that the right people are held accountable. Though a lot of my sources provided this point, none mentioned who this might be, and in my mind, it shouldn't be narrowed down to one group or singular person per se, but the corporation and/or government entities responsible for creation and management of these algorithms, or this algorithm. The third and final point is that of equity. Again, very straightforward. If algorithms are going to be introduced into the judicial system, they need to have a proven equity, and equity, not just equality, between all people, which, as it turns out, seems to be a very difficult task to accomplish. This ties back into my interview and to one of the articles I read, Discrimination in the Age of Algorithms, that introduced an anti-bias discriminator. A few years ago, John Kleinberg, who you can see up on the slide, and a group of co-authors wrote an algorithm trained on arrest data in New York from 2008 to 2013 that could more accurately predict crime than just basic human judgment, even when it was constrained to ensure that the racial composition of detainees tracked that of arrestees. The issue here is that while this is equality, it's not equity. It suggests that the algorithms are not the issue, but the racial composition of arrestee data. This brings me to my original research, and for this I used the programming language that I learned at the beginning of the year, Python, to create an algorithm and train 50 randomly generated networks to try to highlight potential inaccuracies even in the simplest of algorithms. My original plan was to create something in line with what Compass does. However, after realizing of what could actually be seen of the extent, complexity, and scope of the 137 item questionnaire Compass algorithm, I decided to scale it back to something I could learn about and create within the time that I actually had. And in the end, I created a logistic regression model that would attempt to predict a simple rule through the use of a sigmoid function. The algorithm was very bare bones, predicting a rule as you can see up on this slide. It would look at the row of inputs consisting of ones and zeros, and then look at the output, either a 1 or a 0, depending on the rule, and try to learn that rule. The rule would always look like this. Only one of the input columns actually matters, and the output would always reflect what that input column said. As you can see, there are 4 input columns here, and in this case, the first column matters. The output always matches the first column. The algorithm, using specifically a sigmoid function, tried to learn which column influences the outcome. Then when the learning has concluded, the user can query it on a new input data set, and the algorithm tries to accurately predict which column it should reflect. These were the results in 50 networks. All 80,680 of the predictions were correct. An unexpected outcome at the time, though in reflecting, it's understandable that an algorithm so simple would be good at its job. It can easily be seen how a jump from the idea that a simple algorithm that performs so well, the intuitive leap could be made that all algorithms would perform just as well. So what can be done immediately? This wraps back into the final sentence of my thesis. Algorithms should be immediately removed from the judicial system, returning to purely human-made judgments on defendants until further steps are taken to make sure algorithms are equitable. And for the time thereafter, in terms of reintroducing these algorithms into the judicial system, a few areas need to be heavily moderated. Meaningful regulation and restrictions must be put in place in both creation of algorithms and the training data that is used. Algorithms should be made fully transparent by being published and fully explained. A system of accountability for mishaps needs to be put in place. And finally, a broader range of factors should be taken into account to more accurately and more reliably represent people in an algorithm's inputs. Compass uses 137 data points, and it is clearly insufficient. There is also a fact of data representation that expands beyond my research. It is very clear that Black people have been arrested at percentages far higher than white people historically, and these algorithms, trained on this historical data, cannot help but be biased based on it. Better training data representation and accurate percentages of population should be incorporated for decision-making to achieve equity between all defendants. And for my final note, algorithms could have been better, and I really could have been this year as well. I repeatedly and significantly struggled with time management throughout the year, and in the latter half of the year struggled personally with a feeling of underpreparedness that led to a lot of perfectionism, which only fed back into the issue of time management. And while these struggles are definitely still a work in progress, I have started to overcome both perfectionism and procrastination in starting projects early, and I continue to just push through work while still giving myself a loose amount of time for my own self-stability. Excuse me. I would like to take the time to thank Ms. Ferris for being so lenient with extensions and support, my committee, Mr. France and Mr. Haskey, for providing so much support in input and resources, to all of the seniors who have continued to support me throughout the year, and finally, to you all for listening to my presentation today, and I can now take your questions. Got you. I feel like I need to cycle through my sources, but okay. Absolutely. The math room.
All right, it's Emmett.
Emmett.
Hi, Esprii.
Hi.
All right, so I have a question that kind of relates to current events. With the Derek Chauvin trial going on, how do you think algorithms would have impacted the decision in that specific trial?
Oh man. Um. Uh. I am not entirely sure because that's sort of a special case. And algorithms are much more general purpose for like um specifically if I relate it back to Compass, Compass is used for like basic arrestee sort of through the judicial system, make things go faster. Um, for that, and the George Floyd case is such a sort of national case at this point that, excuse me, um, that it is difficult to say if algorithms are being used actively, and that is not much more of a case that they are relying on human minds for. I like I'm not entirely sure is sort of the good answer to that, but I would suspect that it's much more human minds working on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Holly?
All right, so you mentioned earlier that a lot of algorithms were used to determine the likelihood for reoffenders. So how would this data be used in the criminal justice system? So would they use the likelihood of someone to reoffend to be preventative, or would it just be used during a case after they reoffend?
I don't quite follow.
So you mentioned how algorithms are used to determine like the likelihood of someone doing the same violent offense again, and you talked about how like black versus white offenders. How is this information used in their trial?
It is used. Okay, so it is used as a sort of how it is meant to be used. How a lot of sort of practitioners' guides tell it is meant to be used is as a aid to a human mind, to the judge's mind. Though it is more often than not racially profiling, as was seen in a number of reports. So it's an aid that is sort of, I don't know, it's an aid that is faulty to in my mind. But it is used as an aid, sort of a suggestion of risk score to the judge to make their decisions.
Okay, thank you.
Ari?
So you were saying that the algorithm with the 4 inputs, like every single one was correct. But then you said in Compass there's like 136 inputs. Did you say?
Yes. Yeah.
So like, what do you think is kind of the point at which it's too unreliable, and is that based on the data put in or just the number of factors involved?
It is more based on the data put in and quantifying human nature statistically is a very difficult thing to do. And quantifying the sort of human nature of reoffending is incredibly difficult. That was an example. My algorithm within the that I gave that example on had data sets that were much longer, completely randomly generated, and you know they had different dimensions, and all of them were correct. So I think for something that simple that's trying to predict which column it reflects is going to be consistent no matter how big you make it. but for actually quantifying excuse me again, human interaction, human nature through statistics, it is a different different sequence entirely. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I
Great
swear
job,
I-
Esprii.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Have a nice day.
Great job.
Bye. Good job. Bye.
I swear